One of the volunteers. I'm one of the few volunteers at the Papermaking Museum. We're open on Saturdays from 1 o'clock till 3:30, from early April until the end of October. And we're closed over the winter because there's no heating, and also we need to refresh the display. And there's just been a very big one happened. So you might ask the question, why am I doing this? Well, I've listened to the Riveresque Trust meetings for several months now. Very interesting. And I felt it was appropriate to talk about papermaking because if it wasn't for the River North Esk, there wouldn't be papermaking in Penicuik. We believe we are the only papermaking museum in Scotland, and we believe with Google searches there may be two papermaking museums in England. So we are one of the few. And because we're on your doorstep, you should come and visit. Now, many of you will have lived in the locality for a long time, but you maybe haven't realised just how significant Penicuik was in the worldwide, and I do mean worldwide, papermaking industry. And you'll find out more about that as we go on. After 52 years of bringing up a family and living in Penicuik, basically I felt it was time to put something back into the community. So this is me paying some of my debt to Penicuik and the community. What I've got to say is this is a very long presentation and I'm probably not going to manage to do all of it. And really what you're going to see tonight is really just an appetizer of what is available in the museum. So as it says here, come and visit us, please. It's free. I say it's free, but we do accept contributions to upkeep because everything costs money these days. And if you're interested in Penicuik's heritage, you could always come along and join us as volunteers. I knew nothing, absolutely nothing about papermaking in Penicuik until I started volunteering in the museum. And it's been a source of joy, actually, to be able to inform people about what went on in Penicuik over 300 years. So, enough of the introduction. Let's get on with the programme. Many of you may remember this sign. There was one at the north end of Penicuik and one at the south end, and we've been lucky enough to manage to retain one in the window of the Papermaking Museum. Penicuik was the papermaking town. It was. Little bit of poetry for you, which I love. I'm going to let you read it and maybe bring a smile to your lips. So there you go. It's a round robin. Our second claim to fame is that we produced very high quality paper, which went worldwide. And in its prime, Penicuik was the biggest producer of paper in the UK. No small claim to fame, that. A small town, smallish population, we made a heck of a lot of paper. Our third claim to fame is that some of the people that have used our paper, Walter Scott's Waverley, Robert Louis Stevenson's notebook, and surprisingly perhaps, some of Turner's paintings. So a little bit about the history of papermaking. We're going to start off with the early days and go from the Egyptians to the Chinese, all the way through to humble Penicuik. So starting with the Egyptians, they started off making paper with papyrus. It's a paper-like material produced from the pith of the plant itself. Looks a bit like a big reed, actually. So they remove the outer rind, and the sticky fibrous inner is cut into strips. They're placed side by side on a hard surface with a slight overlap, and then another layer of strips are laid on top at right angles. And on the right-hand side of this screen, you can see, interestingly, a bill of sale of a donkey written on papyrus. Everybody used it. So if you imagine the triangles give you some indication as to the way the stem could be cut up. And aside from wet clay, which the Romans used, it was the world's first mass-produced writing surface. And actually in the museum, we do have some sheets of papyrus, quite an interesting material. So you had the two layers that were glued together, and while moist, hammered together into a single sheet and then dried under pressure. And on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see a section of the very famous Egyptian Book of the Dead written on papyrus. Quite a rough product, but they were able to produce some pretty fine writings and paintings on it. So that was papyrus. Let's now get into the area of talking about paper. Well, about 105 years of the common event, a Chinese imperial court official started making sheets of paper using a rather weird and wonderful mixture of fibers and plants. And in the slide here, you can see some Chinese gentlemen cutting up the bamboo. Following on in this series of slides, they are then heating the bamboo to break down the fibers. They also used other items, believe it or not, like recycled fishing nets, mulberry bark, silk, and hemp. The fishing nets, I don't know what they made their fishing nets were made of, but basically we're talking about plant material that comes from either indirectly or directly from plants, because cellulose is the cornerstone of making paper. And in this little picture, you can see them forming sheets of paper using a mesh to collect a thin layer of paper, paper pulp. And for a long time, the Chinese tried to keep the art of paper making a secret. China, over the many years, was often a very secretive place. But it did get to Tibet, and then it spread around the world. And in this slide, you can see them pressing the sheets. So these would be sheets of paper with some inert material between them, and they're really trying to squeeze as much of the water out as possible. It looks as if they're using heavy rocks in this one to remove the water. And then once most of the water has been removed, just as we do in the museum, hang it up to air dry. The Chinese Empire was very large and very effective, and really they needed paper to be able to manage the size and scale of their empire. Perhaps if they hadn't been able to manufacture paper, they might not have been so successful. But there you go. So from the Chinese, I'm going to go off on a slight tangent here very, very briefly. If you've ever wondered why the European intellectual explosion happened round about the mid-1400s, have a read at that book. It's very intriguing and it is related to papermaking, but I'm not going to go there today. Right. So the Chinese started it off, and it got to Tibet, and it worked its way west. Now, roughly in the middle of the picture, there's a town called Samarkand. We'll come back to that later. But basically, you can follow, we're probably talking about the Silk Route moving westwards, Baghdad, Cairo, along the North African coast, and then across into Spain and up into Europe. And we're talking about hundreds of years. Now with the internet, you can do it in 5 minutes. So the Arabs, near Samarkand, there was a big battle of the Talas River between the Arabs and the Chinese, and the Chinese were defeated. And the Muslims managed to obtain papermaking secrets from their Chinese prisoners. I can imagine there might have been a bit of maybe torture or coercion involved there, but the Arabs, apparently, as we understand it, got to understand how to make paper from the Chinese round about the time of that battle. So we've got a papermaking mill in Baghdad in 794 CE, the first one we know of. And the Arabs making paper. I wonder if they're on a magic carpet there, but basically it's got something to do with the script on the right-hand side, to do with paper making. And I'm afraid my Arabic is not very good at all. Some early diagrams. On the left-hand side of this diagram, I've got two men with a sheet between them, and in there they've got the paper pulp. And the paper pulp comes from the hammering machine on the right-hand side. Basically, the hammers would be alternatively hitting the paper to break up the fibers into small, very small pieces of cellulose. And that hammering technique was used for hundreds of years. Here we've got an Arab gentleman leaning over a vat which has got paper pulp in it, and in his hands he's got a mesh screen. And in the lower left-hand corner, you can actually get a better picture of a screen. Fine wires or fibers. It's basically a very, very fine net on which you can put it into the paper pulp and pick up a very fine layer of paper. Up on the top of the picture, you've got paper hanging on a clothesline to air dry. And in the bottom right, you've got the hammer, which is beating the pulp into small pieces to make paper pulp, which in the industry they call stuff. So the Arabs used quite a lot of horsehair in making up that mesh or net on which to collect a very fine layer of the paper pulp. Over the years, the Arab paper makers refined their initial rather coarse process, made it much better. And in a way, this was probably around the time of the explosion of Islamic or Arabic culture. They standardized the language, and they had a transition from oral to written culture. And we know lots about the Arabs and astronomy and the human body. Their knowledge world really exploded round about this time, and probably paper was behind it. Moving on to the Europeans, so the process had been refined, and round about the time that it gets to Europe, we're talking about the start of the Industrial Revolution. We've got lathes to produce running water, to power paddles, water wheels, ultimately steam power, and the whole process was significantly mechanized, and that gave a significant increase in the production of paper. So just to recap, here's a timeline, an approximate timeline of the movement of paper from east to west. This is timeline 1. There's another page to follow. So that's page 1. That's page 2. And there in the bottom right-hand corner, you've got Penicuik, Midlothian. Shouldn't you be proud? So just to do a brief summary then of the sources for making paper, we started off with papyrus, bamboo, mulberry, bark, silk, hemp, cotton rags. Some of us may remember the rag and bone men that went around collecting rags. And in years gone by, rags, as you saw from that poem earlier on, were turned into paper. Esparto grass, we'll talk a bit more about that. Wood pulp. And item 6 there, it wasn't a few months ago, Alexander Armstrong was in Sri Lanka for some reason, doing a bit of a tour, and he actually helped in the production of paper from elephant manure. And if you think about it, it's not surprising. Elephants eat grass and plants, they chew it up in their digestive system, and what comes out the other end is actually a reasonably good starting material, at least, for making paper. And recently we found out in a scientific paper you can also make paper from mushrooms. There's no end to it. So Esparto grass came to Penicuik after the rag and bone, the rag situation. Here we've got a ship taking Esparto grass came from south of Spain and North Africa, arriving in Valleyfield, and then you can see the bale storage in Valleyfield Mill. And what an incredible fire risk that would have been. And quite a few mills, as we'll see later, did go up in smoke. However, let's not forget the humble wasp, because the wasp has probably been making paper for way before the Chinese. This was a photograph of a wasp bike in situ in an outdoor woodshed in one of my friend's houses. Outhouses. And in fact, I managed to, with some difficulty, dislodge it, and we now have it in the museum. Such a frail object. It's incredible when you hold that in your hands to see how frail it is. But wasps were making paper for a long time. In the museum, we've got this sample of paper made from horse dung. Cotton was used as a source for making paper. And if you think about it, cotton's just cellulose fibers. And cotton rags were cheaper and more widely available than linen. Linen is made from fibers from the stems of flax, just another plant material. And this is a scientific paper I mentioned, the Mushroom Journal, winter 1991-92. Miriam Rice found out how to make paper from mushrooms. I wonder if she smoked it. Okay, moving on to the sources for making paper. and some of the many industries associated with it. Here you've got a paper trade review from a company in Edinburgh, looking for rag, rope, canvas, and so on, basically to help make paper. Just a slight divergence into water wheels and mill lathes. You've got, on the left-hand side, you've got the overshot water wheel, the middle one's the undershot, and the breast shot. So just start to move into some of the industrialization and technological improvements necessitated through the making of paper. Here we've got some hammer or stamping beaters, several different kinds. And in the wooden one up in the top right, you can see how there's like a, what do you call it, like a crank system in a car turning, and each one of those hammers would be raised and then dropped onto the fibrous material to shred the plant material into very small pieces of cellulose, suitable for making paper. So that's the hammer or stamping beater. Now, moving forward, the Dutch got involved. Middle of the 17th century, some Dutch engineers thought there must be a better way of beating paper to make pulp. And on the far right-hand side of the program, the image here, you've got an early Hollander machine. And we do have one in the museum, which is working. And as it says in the bottom of the image, newly installed beaters at Pomethorn in 1959. The one we've got in the museum is the laboratory version, where they would do trial runs. And then once they'd got the process right, they then upscaled it to the beaters, as in Pomethorn Mill. And they must have been massive and very noisy too. So you're talking about significant advances here. One Hollander beater could produce 300 kilograms of pulp or stuff per day. That's when you compare that with what they could make by hand, then we're talking of a quantum leap in production rates. This is the laboratory version. Ours in the museum is very similar. And I think that's the next image, actually. Yeah, okay. Right. On the left-hand side of the image, we've got basically it's almost an oval flow pattern. Now, when that ribbed wheel rotates, it will suck the pulp underneath it, chew it up, and spit it out the top end, and the material then goes round the top, down the other side, and back round again. So it's a continual process, and you get a good view of the ribbed wheel on the right-hand side. Now, that ribbed wheel is fixed. So how do we get it to produce finer and finer paper? You start off with a very rough paper pulp, but you can get it incredibly fine. Now, the reason we can do that is on the left-hand side of the image, we've got these weights. Now, as I said earlier, that ribbed wheel is rotating in a fixed plane. However, what we do is we start off by taking off all the weights on that lever arm. So we'll start off with no weights. We'll add a small weight, run the machine for 5 or 10 minutes, add another one, give it another 5 or 10 minutes, and so on and so forth. And basically what that does is that lever will raise the bottom plate underneath the rotary wheel. So the rotary wheel's spinning, not moving up or down, but by raising the bottom plate slowly, we can produce a finer and finer pulp to make paper. And on the right-hand side, we've got image of our paper. Excuse me. Which we put it on J cloths just to keep it separate and let it dry that way. And when we come in the next week, you just literally peel that paper slowly off the J cloth, and you have paper which we can sell in the Penicuik press next door. Now, going back to the technology side of things, we're now moving on to continuous automated production of paper rolls. Basically, the paper pulp will be spread onto a flat wire screen, which moves horizontally through a series of rollers and so on, which will squeeze out water, deposit slurry, and forming the web, which will ultimately make paper. This Fourdrinière machine was invented by a Frenchman. And that's a rough diagram of it. In the head box on the left-hand side of the top image, you would have the paper pulp, and a controlled release would go onto the wire screen, which moves from left to right, goes through a series of rollers which press it, and the dandy roll on the right-hand side of the top image, I'll come back to that. So that's 1856. We're really starting to get non-stop production. One advance they had was this machine. Now, on the machine, you can see the wire mesh. It's going round it. And the paper pulp would be on that, moving round. But this particular machine wasn't just squeezing water out by pressure between two rollers. This one was actually sucking it out. So industrial technology being used at a frantic rate to speed up the production of paper. An early photograph of one of the machines. We're talking about massive machines, and they get even bigger, as you'll see. I think that was taken locally. I'm not sure. And yeah, you can get some idea of the scale. And so it's up to about 13 foot wide. Some of them may be more, but we know that some of them were producing paper on a roll that was 13 feet wide, non-stop, 24/7. Here you've got the start of the process. They talked about the wet end of the production line, where the start of the process, as opposed to the dry end where it's coming off and being collected in rolls. And right across the middle of that image, you can see what's called the dandy roll. I'll explain that shortly. So, Valleyfield had them. In fact, I'm sure all of the Penicuik mills had them at one time or another. But at the bottom there, one of these machines produced in a day as much as could be produced in a week by hand. So well done, the Industrial Revolution. There are many local and or nearby companies which were involved in the widespread manufacturing of paper. Here we've got a company from West Fountain Bridge making many of the machines or parts of the machines for making paper. Bleaching powder was required, especially when they used rags to produce paper. Now, purely by coincidence, I've got a several great grandfathers who actually worked in the Hurlet alum works through near Paisley, producing 5,000 gallons of alum solution in 24 hours. Alum was an important agent in getting the material to fix a dye with. If you didn't have alum involved in the process, any dye you were trying to use with the paper probably wouldn't have worked. So one of my ancestors he was a foreman at Hurlet Alum Works. Small world, full of coincidences. Here's another firm from Leith. Producing the largest paper-making wire. They used 200 miles of bronze wire. And the reason they used bronze, quite simply, was it didn't rust. And the mesh size, can you imagine a mesh with 2,400 meshes to the square inch? Incredible. All to make paper. Bertram's. I can remember Bertram's in Edinburgh in the Sheens area, making a Hollander type machine to produce the paper pulp. Company near Manchester making felts, and felts were used in the production of paper. We dry our paper on J-cloths because they're cheap and they're reusable. Back in those days, they used felt. The dandy roll. Yeah, let's come back to the dandy roll. Invented by a chap who was a maker of watermarks. And some of you, I'm sure many of you will remember having writing paper before we had computer paper, and you could hold it up to the light and you could see the manufacturer's watermark on it. And that was because they used a dandy roll. Don't ask me, please, why they called it a dandy roll. But there's one. That's a close-up of a dandy roll. And we've got one of those. We've got two of those in the museum, actually. And the ones we've got in the museum have got images on them. And the idea is that one's a golden eagle, and when the paper goes under the dandy roll, it will leave an imprint of the image that's on the dandy roll, and that will be transferred to the paper. Quite simple. Looks as if there's a couple of students here working on a dandy roll. And you can see that there. It's actually welding a watermark onto the dandy roll. I can't read it. Probably a very skilled job, because if he gets it wrong, it's going to cost a fortune. China clay was used in the manufacture of newspapers. Okay, getting near the end now. I'm sure you're glad to hear that. I am, because I'm losing my voice. Why Penicuik? Why, of all places, Penicuik? Okay, the Esk Valley Trust, we know why. We had a plentiful supply of clean water available from the River North Esk. We were close to Edinburgh, and Edinburgh, in the time of the Enlightenment, a seat of learning, education, and so on, research, they required a lot of paper, a heck of a lot of paper. So having paper being produced close to Edinburgh made economic sense. With a plentiful supply of rags when rags were used in the production of paper. And remember, rags just mean cotton and linen. Both come from plants. What happened to the rags? Well, during the Napoleonic Wars, Cowans suspended the production because of a lack of availability of rags and a falling market. And the mill and the huts were let out to the Navy to run a camp for POWs. And we know we've got the French prisoners' monument down in Valleyfield. So rags couldn't keep up with the demand. And then they chose to use esparto grass from Spain and North Africa. However, that led to massive river pollution in the River Esk. And very important Court of Session case in 1866, which I'll return to. Reason number 4, why Penicuik? Penicuik had 6 paper-making mills, and Valleyfield was the biggest, and Esk Mills was the second biggest in Scotland. It was sold all over the world, and the Cowan family, who were the owners of Valleyfield, Bank Mill, and Low Mill, did branches as far away as, well, the Antipodes. Why did it fail? Well, other countries developed newer and better paper-making machines. Maybe there wasn't enough investment, but also another factor would be cheaper labour abroad, and Penicuik just couldn't compete. And there you have, I'm maybe being a bit cheeky calling Darmore Mill Penicuik, but it's Auchendinny. And that's the time span for the various mills. So Bank Mill, Low Mill, and Valleyfield all closed in 1975. Dalmore in Auchendinny continued to 2004. The Valleyfield Mill site from above. That's what it looks like on an Ordnance Survey map. And you can see the railways. I haven't really had time to go into the railways, but they were heavily involved in bringing in the raw material and taking out the finished product. That's Bank Mill, looking north up Bridge Street. There's some interesting stories we can tell you about Bank Mill making banknotes, and you can imagine how they had to be careful and none of it left the factory. World War I came. The Cowans were very cunning when they leased the property to the MOD, because they leased the the mills, but they retained the water rights. And really, without the water rights, the mills weren't really any good, had no attraction to any other businesses. There's Bank Mill in the map. Just going to run through them. The remains of the Low Mill along the side of the Esk. Not much left. Although it was quite a big site at one time. You can see it in the bend in the river. And these are the Cowan mills, Bank Mill, Valleyfield Mill. And you can see the railway lines in there as well. Esk mills along near the bridge at the bottom of Harper's Brae. That was owned by the Brown family. And on the left-hand side, you can see the bridge over the river. Maybe helps you place it in your mind. Auchendenny. It made paper for a while, and then it was actually converted to a laundry. The King's Scottish Laundry, it was called. Dalmore Mill, Auchendenny. The machinery there was dismantled and taken to Vietnam. Dalmore on an Ordnance Survey map. Hawmathorn. And its location up Hawmathorn Road. The one big disadvantage there was obviously the water had to be pumped up from the river several hundred feet up to the mill itself. So a little bit about the people who made it happen. First lady was this lady called Agnes Campbell, also known as Lady Roseburn. She inherited the role from her husband when he died, and her husband was the royal printer who had a very lucrative monopoly on printing. And obviously, if you've got a lucrative business in printing, you might want to diversify into making the paper for the printing. So she saw the value in making her own paper, and at a very humble 72 years of age, set up the mill in Penicuik, which later became known as Valleyfield. She leased that from the Clark estate. Then we all know about the Cowan, well, many of us will know about the Cowans. Charles Cowan, formerly a merchant in Leith, perhaps with no background in papermaking at all, bought the mill, called it Valleyfield, and that was really the start of the Cowan dynasty in papermaking. Son Alexander Cown, a Scottish papermaker, and some lesser known philanthropies. Some of the things he did. That must have cost a pretty penny. Funded the reglazing of every window in the Royal Mile. He must have been making a lot of money from papermaking. Gas lighting as a sideline from Valleyfield. Sure the locals appreciated that. Okay. He was quite keen on the education of his employees. Public Lending and Reading Library, founded by him, and then he moved to this purpose-built building in Bridge Street. And if you can read the writing, it does say library and reading room. Now, that was the image taken a few hundred years ago. This is it now. So, recognize it. Designed by F.T. Pilkington, who was employed by the Cowans for various projects, including the South Kirk. So perhaps the Cowans weren't just interested in educating, they're always interested in the religious experience of their employees as well. And you'll recognize this. This was the Cowans' way of looking after some of their unmarried female workers, perhaps to keep them out of the hands of unmarried men or even married men. And locally, this was known as the nunnery. And then you've got the well in the town centre, 1809, to produce a supply of fresh water for the population. It probably had the benefit of not giving his employees more days off work through illness due to waterborne diseases. And the Cowan Institute, also known as Penicuik Town Hall, for sports and entertainment, dances, and the children's school in Valleyfield Road, now somebody's house. How am I doing for time, John? Do you want me to wind up? Can't hear you, John. You're muted.
Yeah, just a few more minutes will be fine.
Okay. Yeah. Mill fires, mentioned that earlier, big problem. You've got lots of heating ducts. You've got paper, esparto grass, and even Esk mills, and the bottom of this one suffered a very destructive fire. As in 1938, when between 2,000 and 3,000 tons of wood pulp went up in smoke. The blaze could be seen for miles around. That's the pulp shed fire, Esk Mills. And they had their own fire brigade. I'm going to skip on that. I'll go back to river pollution. Right. Rags were maybe bad enough when it came to river pollution. But you've got washing and then bleaching, and the discharge often just went straight into the river. When you look at some of the chemicals used in the production of paper, they're rather horrific. When you get bleaching from chlorine, concentrated sulfuric acid, slaked lime, potash, really nasty stuff. And in the early days, it just went straight back into the river. However, the hand of the law had some effect in 1841 when requirements had to be made for maybe not restoring the river cleanliness, but improving it. But then esparto grass came along using caustic soda in the process, and the case went to court in 1861. The Duke of Buccleuch was involved. He fought the case because so many of his trout down in the Dalkeith area they weren't surviving. So more measures were put in place, like settling ponds and trying to use biological treatments, oxygenate the water. But it did cause a lot of river pollution, a heck of a lot. And there's a quote from one of my former neighbours who grew up in Penicuik as a young boy. He remembers the river running white, and maybe some listening to this talk will remember those days as well. And you've got the smell as well. I'm just going to skip over that. Oh, very briefly. The Cowan shell. On the left-hand side at the bottom, we've got the shell motif on the Cowan well. The mistake the Cowans made, they weren't maybe thinking far enough ahead, was that they did not register that trademark. Along came the Shell Oil Company in 1904, and they registered the shell. As a result of the courts, the Cowans had to invert their shell trademark. And it's quite useful because you can use 1904 as a watershed for any documents or literature we come across. It can tell you that was before 1904 or after 1904, just because of the shell. Why the Cowans chose the shell? Don't know. There's more on it. I'm going to skip all that. I could do another talk, John. Population. Between 12 and 1,300 people employed in the industry in Penicuik alone. It really was a significant chunk of the population in the area. So, basically, hopefully as a result of my efforts and you're listening, you've had some idea about papermaking and its influence in Penicuik. So now you can, I hope. I'm going to stop sharing, John.